be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSE Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, ICANN 76 Insights from the Meeting in Cancun. My name is Christy DeMeo-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is Gretchen Olive. Gretchen is the Vice President of Policy and Strategic Account Management for CSE. For over 2 decades, Gretchen has helped Global 2000 companies devise global domain name, trademark, and online brand protection strategies, and is a leading authority on ICANN. And with that, let's welcome Gretchen.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking time out of, I know, what are really very busy schedules, so thanks so much for that. As usual, we've got a packed agenda. ICANN meetings never seem to get kind of less content. It only seems to get more. So we'll spend some time just making sure everybody understands who ICANN is, kind of how they handle the meetings and sort of who's all involved. Then we'll dive into new gTLD subsequent procedures, talking about the operational design plan. We'll talk about registration data policy, implementation review team or IRT, as well as the registration data disclosure and data protection IRT. We'll kind of start coming to the home stretch, talking about the rights protection mechanisms, implementation review team, and then we'll wrap up talking about this meeting's GAC Communique. So a lot to cover, never a shortage of material. So just so everybody's kind of on the same kind of level playing field, in terms of ICANN meetings, ICANN has 3 public meetings a year. We're talking obviously about the March meeting. That's the first meeting of the calendar year. It's typically about a 7-day format. This one's just a couple of, maybe like a day less than that. But it really is, it's a full meeting. There's a lot of working groups. There's discussions on issues. It's really kind of a meeting where there's a lot of interaction between stakeholder groups. So that's the meeting we're talking about this time. Here is an ICANN organizational chart. You know, it's set up like most corporations, right? You've got a board of directors, you've got staff. The difference with ICANN, though, is it's really made up of a number of volunteers. Like, there's certainly ICANN staff, you know, the president and CEO and the staff. There's an ombudsman, but these kind of groups underneath, these boxes underneath, are really groups of volunteers that kind of fit in different categories. In this webinar series, we really focus on the policy work that's done in that kind of center blue box, the GNSO box. That's a generic name supporting organization. And that's comprised of registries, registrars, intellectual property interests, business interests, ISPs, non-commercial interests, not-for-profits. It is a pretty wide group, but a group that has a lot of kind of stake in the internet and how it operates. The other box that we spend a lot of time talking about is that gray, the darkest gray box on the right-hand side, towards the bottom of the slide, the Governmental Advisory Committee, or the GAC. This is a group that, you know, we've talked about them, you know, certainly through this webinar series, but when you kind of look at it, they are a group of government representatives. So they come from like telecom ministries. Sometimes it's the, you know, like e-commerce, if there's like an e-commerce or technology ministry. That's where these representatives come from in their respective, from their respective countries and governments. So they really come to provide ICANN with advice related to sort of the public interest or public policy. So in talking about this structure, there's been some recent changes. So last time we met in Q4 of last year to talk about the last meeting of the calendar year, right before that meeting, there was a changing of the guard in terms of the leadership of the ICANN board. So Tripti Sinha took on the chair, became the chair of the ICANN board, and Danko Jedrovic became the vice chair. So that was a big change that happened. And then in December, we learned that Gordon Marbury resigned as president and CEO of ICANN just before the Christmas holiday, end of last year. Sally Costerton, who was the senior advisor to the president and SVP of Global Stakeholder Engagement, is also now serving as the interim president and CEO of ICANN. An executive search has been started for a permanent president and CEO. That began in January, so I'm sure we'll be hearing much more about that as we kind of get closer to the second meeting of the year. But this is a pretty historic milestone in ICANN's history. So for the first time, the chair of the ICANN board and the CEO and president of ICANN are both women. So, there's a lot of excitement around that. Women have certainly been in a minority in technology, and this is exciting to see that we have two women leading both the board and the organization. But we'll see what happens here, and certainly, Sally is just currently the interim president and CEO of ICANN. So we'll be watching this space quickly. But the one thing, this meeting, everybody kind of walked away from this ICANN meeting feeling like it was like a new positivity. I'll put it that way. I've been going to these meetings since 2000, 2001, so over 20 years. And there's always this sense, ICANN moves at a glacial pace. And particularly it seems like really these last 5 years have been one where there's just a sense that not a lot has gotten done. And I think it's more than a sense that not a lot has gotten done, and that there really hasn't been any major policy implementations in the last 5 years. And so going into this meeting, there was hope of getting things going. But I think by the time the meeting came to an end, there was this feeling that ICANN's kind of position and posture was more of like, let's get things done. Let's stop arguing over the little stuff and let's start getting things done. So that moves us into one of the big areas of discussion during the meeting was the new gTLD subsequent procedures. So just to kind of take everybody back a little bit, the policy development process started for new gTLD subsequent procedures back in 2015. So this was on the back of, the new gTLD round one application period was the beginning of 2012. TLDs started, or top-level domains started to roll out in 2013, really in earnest in 2014 and 2015. And one of the things that ICANN promised the GAC as the new gTLD program was getting underway, because as you may recall, there was a lot of angst about the new gTLD program and sort of, were the right plans in place for that to be successful? And I think those who participated or kind of watched the first round, there was a lot of bumpiness. There was a lot of confusion at times, uncertainty, and just kind of like tensions between different groups, stakeholder groups, ICANN and stakeholder groups, ICANN and the GAC. It was a pretty chaotic time. And so there was this commitment by ICANN that, to the GAC specifically, that once the top-level domains, from the application round started to roll out, in pretty short order, ICANN would start looking at like what went right, what went wrong, and work towards correcting the things that were wrong, so that if and when we move to another round, that those things would be fixed. And so new gTLD subsequent procedures, that's really about like the rules of everything from the application process to rolling out the TLD. That's what this PDP was about, policy development process. So you can see there were like 40 separate topics. They were kind of put into different buckets. You kind of see the different buckets that are there. They call them work tracks. And it really was, a lot to go through. And the work group, spent a lot of time on these things. So finally started in 2015, finally in January 2021, so, 5.5, almost 6 years later, they produced their final report and it was published. The GNSO approved that final report in February, and then they passed it on to the ICANN board. And at that time, ICANN was kind of creating a new process. Through the years, they've received, the way the ICANN process works is a multi-stakeholder consensus policy organization. And what that means is that, the ideas and the policy changes come from the bottom up, and they go through the different stakeholder organizations, and then those stakeholder organizations move them onto the ICANN board. And when that happens, consensus is hard. It's very messy as well. It takes time. But when those policies were coming up to the ICANN board, it was more about these are recommendations. It wasn't like actual policy language in many cases. And there really was no discussion of the cost and the time and effort that was going to be needed to implement the policies. And so in 2021, ICANN created this new process where operational design plans, which included an operational design assessment, needed to be done on these major policy implementations. And so new gTLD subsequent procedures was one of them. And so, ICANN basically said in September of 2021, we need to go through this ODP and ODA process. It was launched, the kind of working group it's a combination of ICANN staff and volunteers. That started in January of 2022. And by December of 2022, the subsequent procedures operational design assessment was delivered to ICANN. So that's really kind of, talks about the feasibility and the cost. The full ODP was delivered to ICANN in top of this year in January 2023. So, that's been handed off to ICANN, and basically at this ICANN meeting, the ICANN board adopted 98 of the recommendations from the ODP. So, large bulk of it was, okay, agreed. However, there were 38 recommendations that ICANN put into a category sort of called pending. What pending means is these need some more work, whether it be work with ICANN and stakeholder groups, or work, there needs to be some further scoping done, that type of thing. 38 recommendations fell into that pending bucket. And then there was a kind of a short list of dependencies that ICANN acknowledged, the ICANN board acknowledged that they needed to resolve. And, they committed to doing that, quote unquote, in a timely manner. So what timely exactly means, yet to be seen, but there, again, seems to be a real spirit on the behalf of ICANN right now of getting things done. But what was interesting about their adoption of these 98 recommendations and sort of, again, kind of setting out this work plan of 98 recommendations, 38 more work to be done, and these dependencies, it really marked the official start of the implementation of the second round of ICANN's new gTLD program. And so a lot of people walked away from this meeting who are, interested in this next round happening. Remember, the first round happened in 2012. ICANN, during that time, had said that they anticipated opening up a second round within a year of the closing of the first. So we're a little off on time there. But, this marked the kind of the official start of implementation. And, by the end of this month, first week of the next, ICANN is expected to call for the formation of an implementation review team for subsequent procedures. So these folks will take these, recommendations, and they will start working through the implementation of that. So let's look at what that looks like. So we'll do that in a couple slides. But first, before I get too far down the road here, I just wanted to provide kind of a quick snapshot. This was actually, it's in the ODA, and it's also was presented during the ICANN meeting. But this is kind of a quick snapshot of sort of the options on how kind of this next round could go, right? So option one is one big application window, much like we did in the early part of 2012, where, everybody just puts in there's a defined set date, everybody can put through their applications, and, that's one option. The other option is sort of doing 4 annual cycles. So, the thought is that if it's not like, here's one big round and it will, we don't know when the next time will be that there'll be an application window, you won't have everybody running to the, proverbial desk to file an application. That if maybe there were more opportunities, that would kind of be throttled, and people wouldn't feel like it's like, I got to do it now, and maybe they would kind of throttle the number of applications per kind of cycle. So, here is kind of a summary or kind of an assessment of how that would impact things like implementation timelines and the systems and tools needed, as well as like internal processes. When ICANN had the 2012 round, they were overwhelmed by applications. There were over 1,900 applications. They did not expect that many. Their processes, their systems were not equipped for that. Their staffing wasn't equipped for that. So it really kind of caused, a lot of challenges. If you do them in smaller rounds, like there can be more manualness that can be handled. Maybe not everything has to be automated. There's obviously less cost potentially because it's not like you have to gear up for, an avalanche, or you're gearing up for, a small, like wave. So that impacts, things like upfront investments and overall costs. There's some concern though about like, how do you, limit that? What happens if you're just like on the other side of, let's say they did batches of 450. How do you deal with the person whose application is 451? That type of thing. So there's just, a lot to consider here, but these are the types of things that are, come out of an ODP and an ODA. But the thought is that, the subsequent procedures implementation review team, or IRT, will start with the 98 things that did get adopted. So there's a lot of work to do there. And this is sort of like just a small snapshot example of like kind of how they would go about that, their methodology. They work on policy implementation first, program design, infrastructure development, and then operationalization. It really, it's comes somewhat of a sequential process, but there is some overlap, as you can see. And each kind of like section, each recommendation is sort of like a mini project. So that's really how they're intending to kind of get this going. And it really is in alignment with what's called the applicant guidebook. That was sort of the Bible, if you will, of the new gTLD program of, how to apply and what would happen after you applied and how things would get implemented. So again, would follow kind of that, try to follow that kind of framework. The things that fell into the pending bucket, I have a little chart here that, kind of the topics. So, everything of, applications assessed in rounds, registry voluntary commitments, and public interest commitments. A lot of these things, if you're, if you were around during the kind of the heat of the launch of round one, you'll remember how controversial some of these things were, name collisions and objections and string similarity evaluations and application queuing, applicant support for maybe, places around the world that, aren't as, wealthy, and organizations that are not as well funded, working with folks around the world where English is not the first language. These were all very hot topics. Registrant protections, security and stability, GAC consensus device and GAC early warning. There was a lot of, toing and froing around that. Auctions. So there's just so much here that, is in this pending bucket. However, I will say, it's not like these topics haven't been talked about. There hasn't been work done on it. There's been a lot, through the policy development process, and subsequently, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of interaction, a lot of stakeholders and different stakeholder groups kind of interacting on this stuff. So there's been a ton of work done on this stuff, but ICANN believes there's still gaps. And so, there's additional work that needs to be done. Is it, another 3 years of work? Probably not. The question is like how long will it take to kind of get resolution on these different areas? So that's the kind of question mark. There's also dependencies. I mentioned kind of a short list of dependencies that ICANN identified. And it really are kind of stemming from further work or planning that ICANN needs to do around advice provided by the GAC, by the Security, Stability, and Advisory Committee, or the SSAC, or the At-Large Advisory Committee, or the ALAC, related to things like DNS abuse and name collisions and closed generics and different interdisciplinary studies, as well as other kind of assessments and evaluations like CCT and SSRT, that is consumer choice, assessment done very shortly after the launch of the program. SSR2 recommendations about how ICANN functions. These are all things that, there were recommendations related to the release of new TLDs that still, those recommendations haven't been either fully implemented or fully kind of fleshed out and discussed and kind of agreed upon. So that's the work that ICANN's talking about, the dependencies that they need to get done, and they're committing to get that done in a timely way. So, subsequent procedures, good news is moving forward in earnest. A lot to do, but we're beyond the ODP, which is that design plan and the assessment, and now we're, that IRT is going to get formed, and they're going to work on implementation. Kind of going on concurrently will also be work around registration, data policy, and disclosure. So this is all about WHOIS. For as long as I have been involved in ICANN, and I again, my first meeting, I'm trying to remember if it was 2000 or 2001. It's been that long, but nonetheless, the hot topic at that point was WHOIS, accuracy of WHOIS. And now it's, yes, accuracy is still an issue, but also now it's about sort of the collection and handling of WHOIS and access to the WHOIS. So as many know, back in 2018, the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, was enacted in May of 2018. And up until that point, ICANN had largely, I'm going to say, ignored various national laws around providing, personal private information and having to kind of, post that in a public way. There were many national laws that kind of provided, protections around that. But ICANN still had in their contracts with registrars and registries and in their policies a requirement where, when you register a domain name, you have to provide your information if you were an individual registrant. Well, when the GDPR was enacted, ICANN had to finally, not only recognize, I think they always recognized there was a conflict, but actually do something about the conflict. And so at that time, they put into place something called the temporary specification, which allowed registries and registrars to sort of redact any private, personal data that would be in violation of the GDPR. And, many of us talk about it as kind of the day the WHOIS went dark. And it's caused all sorts of problems. It's really made it difficult, for IP enforcement, for law enforcement, for security investigations. And, it's a big problem. There's a lot of abuse online. There's a lot of fraud online. And that information had always been somewhat instrumental in helping people piece enforcement actions together. So after the temporary specification went into place, ICANN created two expedited policy development teams, basically. And one was, it kind of broke it into two phases around registration, data policy, and disclosure. The first phase was the collection and handling of WHOIS contact data. And then the second phase was really around access to WHOIS data, not only by registrars, registries, and ICANN, but other third parties, like again, law enforcement, security and fraud investigators, things like that. And then kind of late in the game, they added what was called Phase 2A, I always say Phase 3, was this sort of additional phase to work through the issue of natural versus legal persons and the potential use of a uniform anonymized contact email in what was formerly called the WHOIS record. So those things got going in mid-2018. And by 2019, by June of 2019, ICANN had put together an implementation review team to implement Phase 1. So kind of what was going to be the new data fields, the new things that people had to basically report in the WHOIS. That review team struggled. There were lots of issues, behavioral issues, people just being, not abiding by the standards of conduct. There was a shifting regulatory environment after the implementation of GDPR. And there's just a lot of policy and stakeholder dependencies. And so there's a lot of impatience, and quite honestly still is a lot of impatience around this, like getting off the ground, and particularly the GAC. They expressed a lot of frustration around this because it has really made it difficult to get information that is needed, like I said, for IP enforcement, law enforcement, security investigations. So in March of last year, there was new leadership on the IRT, and they shared a new detailed work plan. And that really projected that they would be done with the policy work by the early part of this year. And then there's like an 18-month implementation window for registries and registrars, because there's going to be changes to the structure and the data used for domain registration and administration. And so there's going to need to be some system changes, et cetera, and some policy and process changes needed by registries and registrars. So that, was encouraging. And then in August of this year, the IRT published their implementation plan and completed drafting the gTLD registration data policy and put it out for public comment. And that extended into December of last year. So, that was encouraging. Things started to pick up there. They posted for public comment looking for, not only kind of direct feedback on the draft policy, but also on some other policies and procedures that were part of that. So ICANN is still reviewing and considering the input from the public comment. There has been a public comment report issued, so it's sort of a summary of all the public comments that were, kind of submitted. And the IRT is sort of, working with ICANN through those comments. But really, once that policy language and implementation plan is finalized, ICANN fully intends to then move right to notifying the contracted parties, being registries and registrars, of the implementation and the compliance deadline. So the current estimate for the publication of the policy, and I don't think they're far off on this one, so I think this is a pretty solid kind of timeline. That will probably happen sometime in Q2, before the next ICANN meeting, and there'll be an effective date basically by Q4 of next year. So this is, this is coming, and this is definitely something that's going to happen. So it's good to see this one, not only getting off the train, getting onto the train track, but actually starting to come into the station. So that's really good. Some expected kind of like high-level changes, if you will. We're not going to go into all the kind of gory details here, but you're looking at basically the elimination of the admin contact in a WHOIS record. You're also looking at, there's going to be certain data elements that are going to be required, for transfer, but there's also going to be kind of some legal questions around that. So, it's really, a little bit of a change there. And then we have the treatment of the registrant organization field. There's been a little bit of commingling over time, registrant organization versus the registrant being more of an individual. So really getting that a little bit straight, so that then, like right now, every registration is treated the same. There's no kind of distinguishing whether it's a natural person or a legal person, right? So, company versus an individual. So trying to get that right from the beginning, shortening data retention, and then, allowing for reasonable access with, there'll be some criteria for that. But, I think these are all things that will, it's going to be new for all of us. And I think we're moving in the right direction. It'll be likely, a little bit to get used to at the beginning, but it would be great to kind of see some of these issues finally get to the station, like I said. The challenges is that a lot of what's changing in the WHOIS is kind of baked into a lot of existing ICANN policies and procedures. I mean, just think about transfers, right? So transfers in the past, it hasn't been since the temporary specification has been in place, but the admin email was really a big part of that transfer process. Things like notifying the admin email address about like UDRPs being filed or URSs or decisions. So there's just a lot where, fields that are in the WHOIS today that will not be in the registration data record at the end of this, there's going to be some changes that are required. So it's not that we're fundamentally changing these policies, it's just there's going to be tweaks that are needed because some of this data and these data fields are baked into these policies. Now, there's 3 areas where it will not impact. So I guess there's something we don't have to do. But you can see, there's far many more that areas that are going to need to be, at least some minor tweaks to as we move forward. So a lot going on. So let's talk about phase 2. So this is about the kind of access to the WHOIS or the disclosure of the WHOIS information, right? So, we're trying to protect people's privacy and their right to privacy and not, publishing information that's not, personal identifiable data under the GDPR. But there are circumstances where, access may be warranted, disclosure may be warranted. So this is where the EPDP phase 2 team was really focusing. And they issued their final report. We mentioned they got started in really got started in 2019 after phase 1 wrapped up. They published their final report in August of 2020. So, in ICANN timescales, both these EPDP teams, got a report out within a year's time. The GNSO approved it, and so that was a generic name supporting organization. And the ICANN board then, we're back in 2020, 2021, 2022, where ICANN was now asking for an ODP for these things, so an operational design plan and an operational design assessment to better understand the cost and feasibility of what was being recommended before the board voted. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Like how do you vote on something that you're not really sure what it's going to cost the organization? You don't know what kind of resources are required. So I think, a good improvement to the process, but nonetheless, it is another step. But in January 2022, the ODA was delivered to the ICANN board. And, this was looking at what was basically recommended in the EPDP phase 2 team. And the challenge was what was being recommended when this report came out. There was a lot of people who were kind of like, myself included, I will admit, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but it was, it had a lot of things that I really questioned whether they could scale, the cost of what was being requested, and sort of the complexity of what was being requested. It seemed like something that would take a long time. And quite honestly, when ICANN worked with some volunteers to put together the ODA, there was this assumption ICANN would outsource much of the work needed to develop what was called the SSAD. That was the model of WHOIS disclosure, or the system of WHOIS disclosure that was created by the EPDP Phase 2 team. But when you looked at the development and implementation, it was like that estimated it would take 5 to 6 years. The cost for development and implementation ranged for the SSAD ranged from like 20 to 27 million, with an annual operating cost of 14 million to 106 million. It just didn't seem like it was going to scale, basically. ICANN would charge for fees for accreditation, requester verification, and disclosure requests to recoup costs that they were going to have to, basically take on. SSAD would also increase, ICANN's kind of liability risk. And while the group that put together the SSAD determined that it was in the global public interest, a lot in the ICANN community, ICANN itself was not convinced that it was in the interest of either ICANN or the ICANN community. So it really did not get it landed with a thud, let's just put it that way. It did not get a good reception, and the ODA kind of like bore that out, I think. We kind of blazed a new trail, and the generic names supporting organization, kind of getting this information back, said, all right, we probably need to take a step back here. And so they created a small team of GNSO council members and former EPDP team reps. That was created in January of last year. And that small team was kind of like sent back to the drawing board and say, like, what do we do now? And the small team came back with a preliminary report to the GNSO Council and said, hey, maybe we need to kind of first start with a proof of concept, like something light here, something that we could use to evaluate and test some assumptions, because there were some pretty significant assumptions made as part of the EPDP Phase 2 team's recommendations. So the GNSO Council then went back to ICANN and said, let's pause consideration of the full-blown SSAD system and recommendations. And ICANN, could you help us design a concept for like a proof of concept, an SSAD light? So ICANN board liked that idea. They directed the organization to design a proof of concept, which is now known, the last few meetings as the WHOIS disclosure system. And in February of 2023, after kind of seeing what, that was the kind of the concept of the WHOIS disclosure system and what ICANN could kind of quickly put together. While not perfect, the ICANN board said, okay, let's start with this light, kind of quick and dirty proof of concept, and let's develop it and launch it. And so that's what they decided in February of this year. Last meeting, we talked about kind of like what that looked like. The timeline is, for development and launch is expected in 11 months. Once it's developed and launched, they want to operate it for 2 years to kind of like collect the data, basically necessary to kind of test some of those SSAD assumptions and kind of look at like, okay, what from the SSAD recommendations could we build onto this that would make sense? What maybe in light of what we see over the 2 years of once this WHOIS disclosure system is up, what are maybe the wrong assumptions or not needed? They're working on trying to figure out what the regular cadence will be on reporting usage data once the thing's launched. But they really want 2 years of operation and then reinitiate discussions regarding sort of next steps in this area. So this is, again, like, let's get something out there, and then we'll see how we do. It will not have a central portal for intake the requests. It's really a very stripped down kind of system. There won't be costs to requesters. There won't be authentication or identity verification of requesters. Only registrars are to respond to requests. Requests will be automatically routed to the appropriate registrar through ICANN's naming services. portal, which we use for other things that we do to interact with ICANN, and then any requester registrar communications, including the disclosure of the data, will take place outside the system. So again, this is a very light implementation. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. There's not a lot of, a lot really built into this. However, I think when we look at last ICANN meeting in the GAC communique, they stated this system is a useful first step towards building a more comprehensive solution. It should facilitate the collection of useful data in a quicker and more cost-effective manner. And I think there is a lot of consensus around that idea. That I don't think anyone really felt like 100% like SSAD's the best and only solution. So I think this is kind of an acceptable next step that will, give some data, and then we can build on that. So unfortunate that it took us this long to get to this place, but at least we're to this place, and that's where at least something is going to get done. So just to kind of give you, a little bit of a picture, if you will. I'm a pretty visual person, and so I always like these graphics that the ICANN staff puts together that kind of pulls up these different kind of work streams that are happening on a particular issue. And so you can kind of see, we started back in 2018. If you look at the bottom of the graphic, it started back in 2018. We've gone through a few years here of, policy work and, scoping, et cetera. And we're now at a point where we're going to implement this WHOIS disclosure system. Should take about 11 months to kind of develop and get up and running. And then we're going to run it for 2 years. And hopefully we get to a point where we get to sort of like an improved system after that. But again, making progress here. So just to remind everybody, when we look at the WHOIS disclosure system versus what was initially proposed, the SSAD, again, you can see the big difference in cost and time and effort, and just, I think it's it's probably, given the alternatives, it's the best next step right now. So, that's where we're going to go. I think it's important to understand some kind of key changes. So it doesn't include a central governmental accreditation authority that SSAD did. Doesn't include accreditation of requesters, SSAD did. Does not include identity verification of requesters, SSAD did. It does not include an abuse investigator, SSAD did. Does not include a billing function or any fees, SSAD did. And there's no obligation or expectation of automated processing of requests by contracted parties. So again, SSAD did. So there's some big things that are, not part of this. And there are risks that come with that. So there's unknown demand for this WHOIS disclosure system, so it's hard to predict the impact on the operating of the system. There's some misconceptions around the data disclosure, the guarantee of the data disclosure. There's system risk. It's vulnerable to malicious or nuisance submissions. There's no abuse investigator. There's no effective way to ban abusive users. There's also legal risk, the potential liability for ICANN. There's significant volume of personal data that's going to be running through this system. It obviously can make ICANN a litigation target. And then there's also going to be updates to naming service portal terms of use, because that's where this is going to kind of where the interaction with the registrar is going to happen. And this is going to raise concerns among contracted parties. Some, maybe not all, but some. So it may delay implementation. So there's also the registrar participation. There's no contractual policy requirement at this date that specifically mandates registrars' interaction with the WHOIS disclosure system. So, requester experience may be inconsistent across registrars. It may be, there may be some, because of the inconsistency, it may drive up the volume of complaints to contractual compliance. data, just the way the data is gathered via the system could be inaccurate because, again, there's a lot of manual pieces of this. So, and there's no integration with the registrar system. So a lot of unknowns. But again, let's move to something. And I think that's what we're going to do right now. So now we're going to move away from the registration data piece of this and move to rights protection mechanisms. We haven't talked about this in a few webinars. Obviously, this was another one of those policy development processes that was initiated after ICANN, kind of got through initial launch of the first round of new gTLDs. There were some new rights protection mechanisms that were, let's just say, trialed during that first round of new gTLDs. And so there was a PDP, a policy development process, to kind of assess what went right, what went wrong, and what needed to be corrected. On whole, I think there was a lot of good feelings about the things that were trialed during the new gTLD program, meaning were they perfect? No. Did they improve things slightly, improve things in different degrees? Yes. So that policy work's been kind of that PDP has been done for quite some time. And really it came to there's tweaks needed, not wholesale changes. So there's an implementation review team that's now working with ICANN on the implementation of those policy recommendations from the PDP working group. And they're going to take a phased approach that allows, for them to kind of tackle those kind of straightforward to implement recommendations first and then kind of get to the more complex ones. That kicked off at the end of last year in December. ICANN estimates that they'll be implementing the 15 recommendations that have kind of been tagged as straightforward recommendations, and that will require kind of a minimum of 5 to 6 months to get that work done. And then they'll work on implementing the remaining recommendations, and that's estimated to take a minimum of 1 year due to complexity and also the need to involve multiple stakeholders. So that implementation is projected to be completed in the third quarter of next year. So, again, work to still do here. But these are tweaks and not wholesale, these are how to get these things rolled out and not really starting from scratch. I think it's really important to understand that this is implementation work, kind of operationalizing what the recommendations are. So I think, we're coming down to the home stretch here. So, it's funny, this meeting really reminded me with subsequent procedures and WHOIS and rights protection mechanisms. It was kind of like that title of the Oscar-nominated movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. That's what it kind of felt like, this major convergence of all this work that's been being done over the 5 years, but now it's kind of going down a path of all right, let's get it done, let's get it to the station, let's go. So that was great to be part of that. I did want to spend a little bit more time than we usually do to talk about the GAC here because their communique was interesting this time, and I wanted to just highlight that. So there's about 180, I think it's actually 181 when I think about it, so I should update that. Countries are territorial members, 38 observers. All told, there's about 500 participants that come, like I mentioned, from telecom ministries or e-commerce or technology, ministries within each nation government. There's really been, the new gTLD program, the first round, really, I often will say it awakened the GAC. It really kind of highlighted that they watched a lot, but they really started to use their voice during that new gTLD round one process. And really, since the pandemic, we're seeing them take a next step in that, using their voice and really asserting their influence. When the pandemic happened, it became abundantly clear that, the internet was critical not only to interconnectivity among people and just sort of this feeling, while we were all being locked down, that there were other people beyond the people in our household, but also just the economic survival of individuals, families, and countries. And so, there's been a lot of increased participation by the GAC, and they are continuing to kind of assert their voice. So at the end of every meeting, they issue what's called a communique. It used to be where it would kind of come out as the ICANN board was starting to meet the last day of the meeting, kind of for the official, going through the official resolutions of that public meeting. It now comes out like a day or two afterwards, but they're, in earnest drafting this throughout the ICANN meeting, different drafting teams, et cetera. But this communique reminded me a lot of the communiques we saw leading up to the new gTLD first round. And what I mean by that is, the communique always kind of talks about the work and the meetings that the GAC had during the meeting, during that ICANN public meeting. It kind of gives you a little bit of an overview of who they met with, the issues they discussed, that type of thing. But then they kind of move into what's called issues of importance, and it kind of gives you insight into the things that the GAC is worried about. And then there's another section that's called GAC advice, and we'll get to that in just a second. But GAC advice is something that you really need to pay attention to. And so let's first talk about issues of importance, and we'll move to that. So in terms of the issues of importance, I don't think any of this is a big surprise, right? They're worried about subsequent rounds of new gTLDs. They want to make sure they really like this operational design assessment kind of process. I think they think that that's a good thing, but they're concerned about some of the findings, like things that still need to be worked out. And so, they're worried about applicant support. They're worried about, making sure that there's an increase in the geographical distribution of applicants. Last round, it was very like North American heavy, and then minor participation from, other regions in the world. And so they really want to make sure that that gets addressed, and also want to make sure that, there's applicant support for people who are from, less sophisticated, less wealthy areas of the world, and where English is not the primary language. So while they appreciate the engagement with the board and the different working groups, they really want to make sure that there's good awareness that there's going to be help for people who want to participate but maybe need some assistance in doing so. Also, DNS abuse, big issue. The GAC has been pretty vocal on this and making sure that there are adequate tools and processes in place to deal with DNS abuse, and they continue to push ICANN on that. Registration data policy, they see some good things happening. They see, things moving along and the care, the ODPs and the ODAs that are going into that, but they want to make sure, that the WHOIS disclosure system, gets up and running. So they want the data from that 2-year trial. And they also have always talked about the accuracy of registration data. And they want to make sure that, as much as we're talking about having this system, the data in it has to be accurate. And with a very self-service industry like the domain industry, there's concerns there still remain. They're also worried about transparency and GNSO participation, people kind of making sure that they are, talking about their, it's very clear what their affiliations are when they are participating in the GNSO, things like that. And then there's an emergency assistance program that, ICANN has, started to send some information to the GAC, but they're looking for, more, and they want to have further kind of like criteria and dates and things like that for implementation. So they're continuing to push ICANN on that. The second piece is GAC advice, and this is the part that I said, this is what kind of brings me back to the first round. It seems like the GAC is starting to heat it up again, and there's a very formal process. The GAC is an advisory committee, and when they give what's called consensus advice to the ICANN board, that is very serious. And what that means is ICANN has this thing called the GAC scorecard, and basically all advice that the ICANN board has received from the GAC is registered on that scorecard. And ICANN, under its bylaws, has 3 options in handling that advice. They can accept it as is, and implement it, whatever the GAC is asking for. They can have questions about it and go back for further information, or they can reject it. Many of you who are around for the first round will remember that there was some very serious back and forth between the GAC and ICANN, and some very formal back and forth under the bylaws about GAC advice that ICANN did not agree with. And you know, this is kind of like the start of that battle. So the two pieces of consensus advice that the GAC gave this time was around IGO protections. Right now, it's not permitted to register an IGO's name or acronym as a domain name. And GAC is reminding ICANN of that and saying, look, there's a current moratorium on that, and that should continue until a full implementation of the recommendations of the EPDP group on specific curative rights protection is properly implemented. So that's kind of a little bit of a shot across the bow, a reminder, a very formal reminder, because that means they're concerned. And then also the WHOIS disclosure system. They basically are advising the board to engage with the GAC's Public Safety Working Group to identify and advance the solutions for confidentiality of law enforcement requests, so that they're not precluded from participation when measuring usage of the WHOIS disclosure system. So some very formal advice that's been put out there by the GAC, and you know, ICANN will have to add that to the scorecard, and there will have to be a formal response to that. So that's very different than issues of importance. Kind of what happens usually is things start off as an issue of importance, and if the GAC doesn't feel like ICANN is paying enough attention or giving it enough of a serious steer, then they will put it on their consensus advice, and that's what's happened with those two issues. So the other thing that they're worried about, and again was in the consensus advice, so there are three things: the IGO protections, the WHOIS disclosure system. The third thing is the privacy and proxy services. So that policy had gone through the whole PDP process and implementation process and was ready to get out the door and get implemented. And then the GDPR happened. And, you know, ICANN delayed because they were worried about sort of like, you know, the privacy and proxy is about, you know, where in the WHOIS you have like a privacy service as a registrant. And ICANN was worried about, with all this stuff going on with the WHOIS under GDPR, that if they allowed this to go out the door, that it would then cause extra complications for the WHOIS work that needed to be done post GDPR. So they kept on delaying, and then there was an official, like, we're going to keep this on cold ice, basically, until all this is sorted out with the WHOIS. The GAC is not happy about that. A lot of people in the community are not happy about that, particularly business and intellectual property owners, security investigators, law enforcement. So the GAC is saying, get on with it. There's no need to delay further. So again, always interesting, always lots going on at an ICANN meeting, and this year this meeting was no exception.